This is an important development, and Professor Xie has been following this in China very closely. Professor Xie has a PhD from Columbia University. He's done college teaching for a decade and a half in New York, and you've been now resident in Beijing for
5 years now?
5 years. He's the director of a project there that translates material from the civil society sector in China and publishes it in an English language edition, which is available online, I believe. So we're very fortunate to have Professor Xie here to talk to us about what the aspirations of the civil society sector is in China and how this conflicts to a degree with the operating conditions in China. If I have mischaracterized what you're going to say, you just go ahead and make your presentation. But I think we're going to learn a lot of useful information about the civil society sector in China. So thank you for joining us, Professor Xie.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Roy. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming out on this nice hot afternoon. And I'm hoping, I think you'll get a nice, maybe, this will be a nice distraction from all the discussion of the budget discussions and debt ceiling debates. We're not going to talk about any of those things here. I'd like to thank the Kissinger Institute for having me here to sort of get the word out about our project and also to talk about philanthropy and civil society in China. The title of my talk is called Same Bed, Different Dreams, and it's a Chinese saying, 传统异盟, and it's about whether the new philanthropy in China and civil society, which really are in the same bed because they're both nonprofit actors, can really support one another and realize a common dream. I'd like to just give you some background on our project. This is, as Ambassador Roy said, I am the director of the China Development Brief Translation Project. And for some of you who are old China hands, you might remember the old China Development Brief, which I think got started shortly after Ambassador Roy maybe left China. And as he said, at that time when he was there, there really was very little civil society. Civil society began really almost when Ambassador Roy left China in the mid-90s.
There was no direct connection.
I wanted to make sure that that was clear. Right. Good. Thank you.
Post hoc ergo propter hoc.
So this is the China Development Brief website, and unfortunately, for some reason, maybe because of the fonts or something, you can't see the Chinese. But this is the Chinese China Development Brief, and they have been operating for about 10 years. They've been reporting and publishing on the nonprofits, civil society sector in China for those 10 years. There's a staff of about 6 people in a little hutong somewhere in the middle of Beijing. And they are a bunch of very committed, conscientious people. And I decided that I would, maybe this is about a couple of months ago, that I would approach them and ask them if they were interested in me translating their material for an international audience. And to my surprise, they said, sure. So I wanted just to make clear that we are not the old China Development Brief, but rather sort of a translation project under this Chinese NGO that covers the civil society sector. So that gives you some idea about how we came about. We've been working on this project now for the last few months. And what I have is a team of about 50 volunteer translators that have been helping me, and I'm the editor. And so I select articles that I think will be of interest and importance to the international audience. And then I farm them out to get translated. And the translations come back to me. They go through a translation and a review. And we just got our website up, and I don't know why only part of it shows on the screen, but
Go to slideshow if you can.
well, this is just a website. But anyway, okay, you can see here that what we have is we have a number of articles that are already up, and these are articles that are all about the philanthropy and civil society sector. And we have a number of NGO resources that we're putting together, so translations of laws and regulations on this sector, statistics, a bibliography for people who are interested in doing research on it. We have articles broken down into news and analysis, people and organizations. We hope to be updating directories of Chinese NGOs and international NGOs in China. And we are planning a special issue. And the first special issue we're issuing is the one I'll be talking about today, which is about philanthropy and civil society in China. And then we have also announcements, job announcements, mostly in the nonprofit sector. If any of you, I see a lot of people, young faces, and if any of you are interested in jobs, I mean, you could look at our website. There's jobs in English here, a few things about funding, projects, conferences. So we're trying to put up these announcements on a regular basis. And so this is our new website, and this is what we're going to be doing. I'll be engaged in over the course of the next couple of years. Our mission is to improve understanding and cooperation between the international community and China's nonprofit sector, and to strengthen that sector's visibility and voice in the international community. I just gave a briefing to some congressional staffers yesterday about human rights and social change in China. And one of the things I said to them is that there seems to be this disconnect between, I think, the rhetoric and policy here in DC and what's going on in the ground in China. We tend to pay attention to human rights issues that are important to our values, things like rule of law, the treatment of ethnic minorities, freedom of expression, and religion. But sometimes those are not necessarily the areas where you see the most change in China. And one of the reasons that I thought about bringing the reporting to light to an English audience, international audience, is because I want them to be aware of all these other changes that are going on that are not being covered in, for example, the international media. What we've been hearing about a lot in the international media in the last couple of months is about the crackdown on civil society, on the arrests of lawyers and human rights activists, and Tibetan monks. And these should be reported, there's no doubt. These are really important events that everyone should know about. But at the same time, I think we've developed these kinds of blind spots. And this is one of those blind spots that I hope to bring to light, and that is this kind of social change that is developing quite rapidly in China in areas like philanthropy and its cooperation with nonprofits. So I'm trying to get the word out, and I appreciate the Kissinger Institute for having me here to help get that word out. I'm looking for funding. If anybody knows of anybody who's interested in funding us, I'd be happy to hear that. I'd be glad to accept a suitcase of small unmarked bills, anything, but anything to fund our work. All our work is really done mostly on a volunteer basis. We do have some small funding from the Ford Foundation. By the way, if anybody's interested in getting regular updates about our website and about our materials, please leave your name cards, and I'll put you in the system. We always look for volunteers who are interested in translating for us, people who have more advanced Chinese ability. So anyway, just something about our special issue, because this is what I'm going to talk about, and that is about philanthropy and civil society. And I chose this because it really is one of the hot topics in China's civil society, and it has the potential to really transform the civil society sector. And it's really one of those sort of positive changes or positive trends that are going on in China's civil society, in contrast with a lot of the negative things that we've been hearing. The way I'm going to organize my talk is kind of like a 3-course meal. I was just thinking about this. So the appetizer will be just kind of a breakdown, a kind of discussion of what is the nonprofit sector, because as Ambassador Roy so perceptively points out, it's not the same as the nonprofit sector here. So I want to go over some terms and sort of identify, what does that civil society sector, that nonprofit sector look like. So that's the appetizer. Then the main course is basically kind of a summary of some of the findings that come out from our special issue. So this special issue consists of 12 articles that were of reporting done by China Development Brief, and we've translated those. So basically the main course is to give you the good, the bad, and the murky on what's going on in this sector. And then the best part is, of course, the dessert. The dessert will be the question and answer session. And I'll try and leave plenty of time for that. So let me go to my, let me go here to my to my PowerPoint and just talk a little bit about this nonprofit sector. So the nonprofit and NGO sector, I mean, just in general, what is the nonprofit NGO sector? When we talk about it, we tend to refer to a sector of voluntary, non-governmental, self-governing organizations, networks, and movements. And this is what we also call part of the civil society or the philanthropic or the third sector. So the first sector is government, the second sector is business sector, and then the third sector is this nonprofit sector. In terms of why this sector is important, I'm just kind of listing a few things here, but the nonprofit sector fills important gaps in service delivery. It's a source of independent advocacy and supervision of both the business sector and of government. It's a source of creative ideas and flexible solutions. It also provides opportunities for self-improvement as a person and a citizen for those who participate in this sector. It's part of, I think, that kind of democracy building at the grassroots level that's really important. And finally, it is important for building social capital, for building trust and networks and bringing together people from different sectors to solve problems. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the nonprofit sector internationally, and I think in China. And of course, as Ambassador Roy says, I mean, when civil society started out in China, it was more quasi-civil society. It didn't quite fit into this definition. It was more government-initiated civil society. But again, that has changed somewhat, and I'm going to talk about that by just giving you a layout of the landscape of the different kinds of organizations in China. This is taken from a book that I edited. And in this book, we tried to give you a kind of a diagram that can help you understand this. So the organizations on the very left are the organizations that belong to the government, the state. And the organizations that belong to the right are more independent organizations, organizations that we would think of as belonging to the civil society sector. So the very left side, you can see, of course, government agencies, public institutions called 事业单位. A lot of universities, for example, in China are public institutions, and then state-owned enterprises. So these are all part of what we would call the state. Then there are some organizations which kind of they're not part of the state, but they're closely tied to it. So these include neighborhood and village committees at the very basic level, and also mass organizations. For example, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, the Women's Federation, the Communist Youth League. These are all considered mass organizations, and they have close ties with the party state. And I would call these sort of quasi-state organizations, along with what we call NGOs. In China, there are some interesting organizations that sort of defy definition. So NGOs are one of these. They're government-organized, non-governmental organizations. Kind of contradiction in terms, but those are the kind of government-initiated NGOs that Ambassador Roy was talking about. And there's a lot of NGOs got started in the 1980s, early 1990s. Then below that, there's a collection of organizations that we might regard as more properly within the nonprofit sector. These are organizations that are more independent, semi sort of NGOs, and also NGOs that are registered. So in theory, what is the nonprofit sector in China? In theory, it is organizations that are registered in those three categories: SOs, or social organizations, PNEUs, which are popular non-enterprise units, and foundations. So those are the three that categories that fit into the nonprofit sector. These organizations have to be registered with civil affairs, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, or the Civil Affairs Bureau below the national level. So we can regard these as nonprofit or non-governmental organizations. But then below that, there are also some other nonprofits or NGOs that are registered, but not with civil affairs. They're registered instead as businesses. All right. So here again, we have another contradiction in term. We have a for-profit, non-for-profit. All right. But again, a lot of these nonprofits that register as businesses regard themselves as NGOs or nonprofits. And then there are unregistered NGOs. So what you can see in this landscape is that even though in theory the nonprofits are only supposed to be in this sector here, these three categories. In fact, there's a much broader range of organizations that consider themselves as nonprofits and sometimes call themselves nonprofits. In fact, some mass organizations, when they go out and present themselves to the outside world, call themselves nonprofits or non-governmental organizations. So in reality, you have this tremendous spectrum. There's no clear-cut line between what is government and what is the non-governmental sector, but you have the spectrum from sort of quasi-governmental organizations to more independent organizations. So that is the nonprofit sector. That's the landscape. And again, the ones more to the right are more independent. They're what I would call bottom-up or grassroots NGOs. And the ones to the left, the NGOs, the kind of gongo type organizations, are more government-imposed organizations. So that is the landscape. And again, if anybody has any questions about this, I'll be glad to help try to make some sense of it. These are just some examples. These are, again, this is taken out of our book. And these are just examples of what kind of organizations, examples of organizations that qualify as government agencies, organizations that qualify as mass organizations in the second column. The third column are organizations that qualify as gongos. A very famous one is called the China Youth Development Foundation. That they started the Project Hope. Project Hope is a whole bunch of these rural schools that were funded by this foundation in China. Semi-NGOs, and then finally more independent NGOs to the very right column. Anyway, I won't go through all these organizations, but just to give you some sense of some examples. This is just a source for these slides. Again, they were taken from this book that I edited called State and Society Responses to Social Welfare Needs in China, Serving the People. Here is a sense of the numbers. This is the number of NGOs that are registered with civil affairs. So legally registered NGOs. From 96 to 2004, you can see in 96, there were only social organizations. The gray bars are social organizations, 社会团体. The bars with the diagonal lines are 民办非企业. Those are the popular non-enterprise units. Popular non-enterprise units are more like service delivery organizations. They provide health services, like migrant schools for migrant children. These would be sort of those kinds of popular non-enterprise units. Whereas the social organizations are more like membership associations. You can see that the second category, the 民办非企业, only started in 1999 when regulations came out for those organizations, and they've climbed quite rapidly. Here's another here's another graph. 2001 to 2008, you can see that social organizations, those are the ones in purple, again have gone up to, they number about 250,000 now. The popular non-enterprise units now number close to 200,000. Those are the ones in the sort of dark brown or maroon bars. I should say that a lot of the 社团, a lot of those social organizations are they have close ties with the government. They're not really independent, the way that we would think of a nonprofit. So that gives you some sense of how they've grown, and you can see here some consistent growth over this last decade. Now here are the foundations, and this is really the subject of the talk. The foundations are really interesting. So foundations, there have been government-initiated foundations for some time now, and you can see that these are the number of foundations. The purple bars are the total number of foundations. Starting in 2004, a new regulation came out that created two different categories, one for public foundations and one for private foundations. At least that's what I call them. So public foundations are mostly NGOs. They were established with government by some government agency, or they had close ties to the government. Private foundations mostly have been established by private entrepreneurs, private companies. You can see that before 2004, all those foundations, like 2003, 2004, those are all public foundations. And then suddenly in 2005, with this new regulation, you had the emergence of private foundations. And what's astonishing is the number of private foundations has gone up very rapidly. This year, both public and private foundations will exceed the 1,000 mark, and private foundations will rival public foundations in terms of numbers. Okay, which is quite astonishing given that private foundations only had about 6 years to develop. There's also other estimates of nonprofits, and I don't want to bore you with it, but again, some people, I said that there were also nonprofits that were registered as businesses. Some people estimate that there are maybe around 200,000 of these nonprofits that are registered as businesses. Wang Ming, who's a professor at the Tsinghua NGO Research Center, estimates that there are about 500,000 community-based organizations, 300,000 rural community associations, 1.6 million rural technical associations, 50,000 to 100,000 religious groups. So with maybe a total of 2.5 million grassroots associations. I have no idea about these numbers. All kinds of numbers are thrown around. You have no idea, no way to verify it because, again, a lot of these are not registered. They're registered improperly or not registered at all. But I think we can safely say that there's somewhere between 500,000 to 2.5 million of these nonprofit organizations in China. To put this into some perspective, though, we have to recognize that the nonprofit sector is still in its early stages. So, for example, and these are just statistics that I took out of our special issue. The total annual budget for China's environmental NGOs is about 4.6 to 7.7 million US dollars. And compare that with the 3 billion US dollars that environmental NGOs here in the US get. That means Chinese support for environmental NGOs is about 1/1000th the level of support in the US, even though China's GDP is 1/3 that of the US GDP.
But you comment on the tax status. There's no tax advantage to contributing to
There is some tax advantage to contributing only to legally registered NGOs and foundations, right? So if you wanted to give to a nonprofit that was registered as a business, you got no tax advantage. Now the tax advantages are they are in the regulations, but a lot of people don't even know about them or understand them. So a lot of people don't take advantage of those tax regulations, but there's tax advantages for both individuals and for companies. Another sort of statistic, the US, in terms of number of foundations, it looks like in China the number of foundations have risen very rapidly, but keep this in perspective. The US has about 1 foundation per 3,000 people. Taiwan has roughly 1 foundation per 4,600 people. China has 1 foundation per 650,000 people. The total assets of most of the foundations, the 1,288 foundations in China that we have data on, in 2009 amounts to about 39 billion yuan, which sounds like a lot, but it's only about 11% of the Gates Foundation assets. So the upshot is China's China's nonprofits and foundations are growing significantly, but they've only just started. Okay, so that was the appetizer. And I guess it was a longer appetizer than I expected it. But let me just kind of go through the main course. And the main course is basically about what are the key findings that emerge from the articles that we've translated. And I've organized this into the good, the bad, and the murky. So the good, or the positive trends are, first of all, that there are a group of foundation leaders in China who are committed to increasing transparency, accountability, and professionalism in the philanthropy sector. And there's also, these people are interested in encouraging foundations to support nonprofits. And that's really important, to get the people with the money, the private entrepreneurs, to support China's civil society. Here's a number of these private foundation leaders, organizations like Narada, and the head of Narada is probably the guy at the very lead of this attempt to try to promote this whole sector, and his name is Xu Yongguang, and he is the founder of the Project Hope that I spoke about earlier. U-Change is another foundation, Vantone, Tencent, which I know sounds like a cheap foundation. It's not probably the best name for a foundation, but it's, I think, the name of a major internet company in China. And also the Society for Entrepreneurs and Ecology. This is an association of entrepreneurs who came together with an interest in protecting the environment. And they established their own foundation, and they give a lot of their money to environmental NGOs in China. So that's part of the good news. Another good news is that there's a number of initiatives that have come about in the last 2 or 3 years, that have emerged to promote the goals that I talked about above, that is promoting transparency, accountability, and professionalism in the philanthropy sector. So one of those is the China Private Foundation Forum, and the other one is the China Foundation Center. The China Foundation Center was established last year. It's modeled after the U.S. Foundation Center. It's interesting, a number of these foundation leaders kind of look to the U.S. as their role model because philanthropy is a big area, and it's a major sector here in the U.S. compared with, say, Europe. I had the picture again. I have the websites of all these kinds of organizations up. So here's the website of the Narada Foundation. Some of these organizations have an English website as well. This is the China Private Foundation Forum's website, and these are pictures. They've held 2 sessions, one in 2009 and one in 2010, of private foundations to talk about these kinds of issues like transparency and accountability and professionalism. This is the China Foundation Center's website. They have an interesting website. They're going to gather data on all these foundations. They have a whole map of China. You can see regionally how these foundations are distributed, and they're going to try and provide information about how foundations where they get their money from and how they use their money, because they believe that Chinese society they're not going to start trusting these foundations and giving them money until these foundations show that they can be transparent and trustworthy. So that's what their goal is. Another piece of good news is that the rapid rise of private foundations provides an alternative source of funding for China's NGOs. And this is really positive for several reasons. One is that international NGOs are reducing their funding commitments in China. They no longer see China as a developing country. A lot of nonprofits in China got their start with international funding. And now they're seeing that kind of cut back. There's more competition for international funding. So the rise of these private foundations is good news because it provides that alternative source of funding. Also, domestic funding is less sensitive than international funding. NGOs that get money from overseas tend to be viewed more sensitively or more skeptically by the Chinese government. Finally, another piece of good news is that there's more interest from other sectors, like the NGOs, like the public foundations, in supporting independent nonprofits in China, especially after the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. So gongos and public foundations never used to fund real nonprofits in China until 2008. And now they have started to provide some support to these nonprofits. So what we're seeing is that China's nonprofit sector, its independent nonprofit sector, is getting some recognition and being seen as, is getting some legitimacy from the government sector. In other words, these NGOs, these nonprofits are starting very slowly to join the mainstream of Chinese society. After the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, the Chinese Red Cross gave 20 million yuan to projects, a number of which belong to grassroots NGOs for rebuilding earthquake-stricken areas in Sichuan province. My son did a 6-week stint as a volunteer for Global Village, which is an environmental NGO rebuilding a village in Daping village up near Chengdu. And that was funded by the Chinese Red Cross. And the Chinese Red Cross is a gongo. It's a government-organized NGO. So these are all good signs. Now, of course, there's also bad news as well. And I counted that I guess the number of bad things I had, or the number of sort of negative trends somewhat outweighed the bad. But let me just kind of go over some of those. One of the bad trends, one of the undesirable trends is that philanthropy in China is still dominated by gongos and by public foundations with government ties. So this sector is plagued by bureaucratic norms of decision-making and lack of transparency and accountability. And another foundation that's really interesting is the One Foundation. The One Foundation was started by the martial arts superstar Jet Li. And he's really committed to supporting grassroots NGOs. And he was able to register recently as a public foundation in Shenzhen. And this is really major news because public foundations are allowed to fundraise publicly. Most public foundations are gongos. But you can see that their website has a donation page. If you go on to the website of private foundations, they cannot have a donation page because that's public fundraising. Here's the Chinese Red Cross. Chinese Red Cross is also a gongo, and you can see that it also has a donation page. A lot of the money that was raised in the Sichuan earthquake went to organizations like the Chinese Red Cross. However, in recent, you may have heard that there were some scandals in the Chinese Red Cross. So that highlighted some of the problems in this kind of gongo government, the sector of public foundations with government ties. Again, the lack of transparency in the sector. Like this is a restaurant receipt that was taken by some guy who took a picture of this receipt and put it on his microblog, and it spread like wildflower. And then it's a receipt of a Shanghai local branch of the Red Cross for 9,859 yuan, which is about $1,500 US. This is for a meal at a restaurant for like 17 people. So the average cost of the meal was like $88 US per person, which is exorbitant in China. And so a lot of people really criticized the Red Cross, and they said, how could you do this? And the Red Cross it came back and it said, well, the expenses for this restaurant meal came from our administrative budget, and they did not come from money that was donated to us by the public. But in any case, they had to try and defend their actions. More recently, you may have heard of another scandal that came about because of this woman Guo Meimei, who was put pictures of herself on her on a blog in a Lamborghini, and she had all these other sort of nice things that she was showing off, and she was boasting of herself as being like part of the Red Cross has a commercial unit, and her boyfriend is on the board of this commercial unit, and she was boasting how she was head of this commercial unit, and her boyfriend had to resign from the board as a result of all this scandal. But all this has kind of got people to talking about, again, that lack of transparency in this whole sector. So again, that's again part of the sort of undesirable trends that's going on. And a second undesirable trend is that there are still a number of vested interests in the current philanthropy system. Gongos and public foundations still enjoy many privileges, and that's going to make the philanthropy sector more difficult to reform. Third, there's really no major breakthroughs in the regulatory environment for nonprofits. And this is something we've been waiting for a long time, to make it easier for nonprofits, for NGOs to register. This is why a lot of NGOs and nonprofits register as businesses, because they can't register with civil affairs. Private foundations and NGOs still face major constraints. So in terms of registration, in terms of fundraising, they can't, again, go out and raise money publicly. They can't hold events, public events to raise money. They face major constraints in terms of capacity building, in terms of legitimacy. There have been some minor regulatory reforms that have made it somewhat easier for certain categories of nonprofits to register, and some cities are experimenting with this. Cities like Shenzhen, where Jet Li's One Foundation was able to register. Fourth, another undesirable trend is the uncertain regulatory environment also pushes foundations to fund projects and organizations in less risky sectors like education, poverty relief, and environmental protection, and to stay away from areas such as legal aid and advocacy. These are the areas that are regarded as more risky. These are the areas where you've seen more crackdowns, you've seen arrests of lawyers and human rights activists. Foundations don't want to touch that at this point. A fifth undesirable trend is that there's still a gap in philosophy, practice, and communication between NGOs and the foundation world. NGOs cultivated real close ties with international NGOs and foundations, and they were used to international practices and standards. But Chinese foundations have very different ideas and approaches, and they're really new to this whole idea of grant making. So they're still private foundations, I think, are still trying to figure out what their mission is, what their role is, what their direction is. And there are differences among these private foundations. Again, there's a few of these private foundations who are taking the lead to try to make foundations more transparent and professional, and to give money and support to civil society, to nonprofits. But there's a lot of foundations that were started by private businessmen who were started because they just want to promote their businesses. They want to promote their brand. They're all about self-promotion. They don't really have any social values they tie themselves to. So there's this kind of debate going on right now in the foundation sector about, again, the direction that the foundation should go. And I guess that kind of allows me to end with the murky. And the murky really is that it's still too early to tell which direction this is going to go. Because in the debates, there's still debates going on about the direction in which NGOs and philanthropy should move. Should NGOs cooperate with the government and NGOs? Should foundations engage in grant making? Should they support NGOs, or should they run their own projects? So, again, I think we're just in the early stages, but I think this is a really important trend. It's an important thing to keep our eye on. What does the future hold? I kind of want to end with a quote by a prominent foundation and nonprofit leader who said this at the second session of the Private Foundation Forum. She said, "Private foundations and grassroots organizations are a critical link in public welfare, and our common mission is to improve Chinese society. We have to bear in mind that our cause has another function that can't be ignored. Although we're just doing one project after another, the big picture is that we're trying to create a new society in China. The goal of a new society requires us not to simply go about doing projects and complaining about one another, but to find a deeper common purpose and a clear idea of how to realize that goal." And I think that's important, because what she's saying is that even though she's trying to say that foundations and nonprofits, they're in the same bed, but we have to have the same dream. We have to have a common goal. And I'm hoping that in the next couple of years, we'll see foundations and nonprofits move in that direction. So I think I'll just end there and take questions.
Thank you, Professor Xie. Awful lot of information packed into your hors d'oeuvres and main course.
Right.
The floor is open. Yes? Could you identify yourself, please, when you ask the
Yes,
question?
I'm Barbara Pillsbury. I'm an international consultant working in the health sector, including in China. And recently I've been working with a Chinese dissident who is in the United States trying to establish a 501c3 here to raise funding to go to his nonprofit organization in China, which has been one of those organizations working on human rights issues, and currently it is one of those organizations for which the funds that have come from foreign donors, in this case the European Union, have been frozen by the Chinese government. So those funds have been donated, but the organization in China can't get them out. And we have heard now that there is some loosening up on that by the Chinese government, and if the foreign donor goes through a long process of getting notarized and the organization is notarized to receive funds from that foreign donor, then the money can get out of the bank account. I wonder if you could just address that whole situation of the frozen funds of foreign donors to Chinese NGOs.
Okay, sure. Yes. Thanks. Good question. So yeah, just to give you some background, like I think end of 2009, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange came out with new regulations that basically it made you go through more paperwork. They want to kind of better regulate the flow of foreign money into China. And so I think from what I've been hearing is that, so, you can transfer money from, let's say, your account here or to the bank in China, and then they have to convert it, and then the problem comes when the nonprofit wants to try and get a hold of that money in Chinese renminbi from the bank, and then they have to go through this kind of notarization and so forth. This process. I have heard that I've heard mixed stories. I've heard that some organizations have been able to get their money from foreign donors, others have not. So it's been kind of a case by case basis. Sometimes the banks don't even understand these regulations. So they themselves, I think, are trying to figure it out and work through it. I don't know what to say in terms of other ways. I assume that establishing a 501c is going to. You could do that. The question, I guess, is then how to get the money from that organization to the Chinese organization. There are other, you probably know of Give to Asia, which was established by the Asia Foundation. Give to Asia provides a way for people here to give money to Chinese nonprofits. It goes to Give to Asia serves as like a fiscal sponsor. They charge like a 5% administration fee. The nonprofit in China has to go through a due diligence process. And if they complete that, then they're eligible for receiving funding through Give to Asia. Give to Asia will put up on their website, they have a page, they'll put up a page for that nonprofit, and Americans can donate with credit card and PayPal. So they provide a way of doing it as well. Another way would be to ask another American nonprofit that's registered as a 501c3 is to ask them to serve as a fiscal sponsor as well.
We have some regulatory complications as well because of the restrictions on having funding that goes to terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. So having served on the boards of some nonprofits, it becomes complicated determining how to fund operations and meet the requirements of U.S. regulations and stay out of trouble that way. So it's complicated at both ends.
Right.
But more in China, I think, than at our end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, yes.
You mentioned briefly.
Please identify yourself.
Mm-hmm. My name is Dana Lutnager, and I'm a recent graduate of Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. You mentioned briefly about the uncertain regulatory environment for NGOs in China. And I've seen even some more populist Chinese publications calling for an NGO law or something similar. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more about the politics or the issues that are delaying this kind of NGO law and what the prospects are for it, in your opinion. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Good question. we've been waiting for regulations to come out, new revised regulations to come out for registration and management of both social organizations and these popular non-enterprise units, both nonprofits, and for foundations as well. And every year it seems like somebody in the know leaks the news and says, well, there's going to be these new regulations that come out. Lo and behold, nothing comes out. I think what's going on is that, and we heard this again this year, and I highly doubt, I would be very surprised if something came out this year, because you have the run-up to the 18th Party Congress, the new leadership will come into place, the government will be up, they'll be on there, they'll be, I think, concerned about security and social stability. So I'd be surprised to see that. But I think, what you can see, from my understanding, from what I can see, and it's hard to understand what is going on within the Chinese government, it's a big black box, but is that the Chinese government is, it doesn't like the current situation where there's so many NGOs that are not registered or registered businesses. Especially civil affairs, the Ministry of Civil Affairs just does not have a grasp of all these NGOs. It just can't manage them. They're interested in trying to bring a lot of these nonprofits back into the fold, to register them so they can have some kind of supervision. And I think they're trying to do that. They have these local experiments. They're trying to gather data about what works best, and they're trying to then, these will feed back into national legislation. But remember that there's also, when it comes to finalizing these regulations, when they have to go through the State Council, which is the highest body in the executive branch that has to prove it, there are other voices. There are people from the security agencies that have concerns about NGOs and nonprofits and about their foreign influences. So I think there's this kind of debate going on. And right now the debate hasn't been resolved in favor of nonprofits. And again, you do see some signs that there is this interest in bringing NGOs back in and recognizing them as legitimate actors. The government recognizes it can't do everything. It can't provide social services to everybody. It needs help from the nonprofit sector, just like the American government relies heavily on help from the nonprofit sector here for delivering of social services. So you do see that recognition. The question is whether they're going to actually put that into law. And at this point, I haven't seen any significant changes there.
Could you, as an extension of that, could you comment briefly on the connection, if any, between the role of NGOs in the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union and increased concern about NGO activities in China? Right. I know that in Russia there was a negative feedback from that. Have you seen the same phenomenon in China?
Well, yeah, I think there was. I think there was that sort of the fear. This color revolutions. A number of these revolutions were supposedly instigated, or NGOs that were funded by foreign donors played a role in these color revolutions in the former Soviet Union that brought about the end of these regimes. And so Chinese government took a great interest in this, and they said, whoa, NGOs, what are they doing involved in these revolutions, and maybe we should keep it tighter. We need to keep more of a check on these NGOs to supervise them more closely, especially NGOs with foreign ties. And this is what I was talking about, is that foreign funding tends to be viewed more sensitively by the Chinese government, in part because of these color revolutions. And I think that maybe one way out for nonprofits will be to rely more on domestic funding, rely more on support from homegrown Chinese foundations, rather than organizations here who the Chinese government suspects of fomenting revolution in China. And of course, what happened in North Africa and the Middle East hasn't made the Chinese government any less, nervous about that. In fact, probably more so. There's a lot of anxiety, especially with the call for a Jasmine Revolution in China. And again, you have seen, I think the crackdown on some of these activists and lawyers is a result of that.
Yes.
I'm Helen Raphael, Resources for the Future, and I taught environmental science for 2 years at Sichuan University in Chengdu, just before the earthquake. But in your initial chart of NGOs and NGOs and so forth, one of the listings was religious NGOs.
Right.
And I'm wondering, I mean, do you have in Xinjiang, do you have a religious NGO forming for the Muslims and stuff like that? I'm sure not.
Well, no, I mean, you know, religion, of course, as everyone, I mean, as you know, is tightly controlled in China. And this is probably what you're referring to. This person estimates somewhere 50 to 100,000 religious groups. These could include, Buddhist charities, underground churches, you know, these kinds of these kinds of organizations. It's very hard to document these because they're not registered. And of course, religion is one of those areas that's quite sensitive. I mean, in addition to legal aid and advocacy, yeah, I mean, religious NGOs, that are based in Xinjiang and Tibet, those are areas that, you know, if you want to keep working in China, you tend to you stay away from those issues.
Are there any known registered religious NGOs?
Well, there are NGOs that are there's NGOs with I mean, for example, let me give you a good example. The Amity Foundation. The Amity Foundation is one of the best known foundations in China, Nanjing. It's actually an independent foundation, but one of the only independent public foundations. It has religious Christian background, and they have good ties with one of the government agencies. I can't exactly remember what, but they've done very well for themselves. I mean, they just built new offices in Nanjing or Nanda, and they're growing quite rapidly. But there are also nonprofits in that are Tibetan. They're trying that are about preserving Tibetan culture, for example. You know, there's those kinds of NGOs. I don't know if you call them religious, but they're sort of more cultural or, you know, having to do with ethnic minorities. There are those as well. Again, those tend to be, you know, more sensitive.
Yes?
Hi, I'm Sarah Neville. I'm with the Joint Council on International Children's Services. On your spectrum of governmental organizations to NGOs, I noticed that social welfare institutions were all the way over on the state side, but there are a lot of, I know, American and foreign nonprofits that work in Chinese orphanages, and I was wondering if you can comment on how that works when you go with independent organizations and government-controlled SWIs.
Yeah, you're talking about this chart here?
Yeah.
Yeah, this, so these organizations, by the way, you might be interested, but there's one of our contributors to this book was Catherine Kaiser. She wrote something about child welfare in China. And yeah, social welfare institutes and child welfare institutes, apparently they are the state orphanages. So those are part of the government sector. And I'm sorry, your question was more about what the... Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are. I mean, there are apparently. I mean, some of these organizations. I mean, I can't remember if it's the ones to the right, Grassland Home or Angel's Mom. They do have some working relationship with, like, the social welfare institutes. There's some interesting. You know, I mean, some foreigners have been able to have interesting collaborations with state agencies, and I don't mean to say just because they're a gongo or something that, you know, they're not worth working with. I mean, sometimes it is a good way to sort of get access to the system, to for example, I mean, if you're interested in orphans and working with and trying to provide services for orphans, you know, to working with the state system. So I don't know exactly, you know, how many there are, but. Yeah, I think what's important is that, you know, they recognize that there's this sort of distinction, I think, between gongos and sort of more independent NGOs. I think sometimes foreign organizations that work with the NGOs tend to misunderstand the nature of these organizations. So I'm trying to see if I can find a, so just to give you an example, one really well-known foundation is called the China Charity Federation, which is really set up by the Ministry of Civil Affairs. And in fact, their website is on the Ministry of Civil Affairs website. And yet, here's an organization that works with them. I don't mean to isolate or target to point out this particular foundation, but here's what they say about the China Charity Federation. The China Charity Federation is a nationwide non-governmental charity organization. It was established in 1994 with approval from the Chinese government and was legally registered as an independent entity. That's not true. You know, that's not true at all. It is a government. It's established by the government at the local level. Its offices, it shares offices with the local civil affairs. It's really a gongo. And yet, I think a lot of this misunderstandings come about because some of these actors present themselves to the international community as nonprofits or NGOs as a way to raise money.
If I may,
Yeah.
I have an example of one of those, Half the Sky Foundation, which you may have heard of.
Yes, Half the Sky, that's a good example. Right.
I know because my wife's been very active in it. And it's an American registered foundation, but it's worked very closely with the Ministry of Civil Affairs, as you know. And they have been extraordinarily successful in providing a model for management of orphanages. And the Ministry of Civil Affairs has asked them to set up model orphanages in all the provinces of China.
Right, right.
So there's one example, anyway, of an organization that's been quite successful. It raises money in the U.S., in Hong Kong, not in China, but it uses those funds to then support their programs in China.
Right, and that's a really good example.
I'm Doug Spellman. I'm the deputy to State Roy here at the Kissinger Institute.
And Doug, that's a really good example. And that case of Half the Sky was actually written up by in that chapter that I talked about. And there's other organizations like that. I mean, people who are really savvy, they know how to work within the system, and have done great work.
Sir? Yeah.
Milton Kotler.
Here's the microphone.
Milton Kotler. I've had a business in China for the past 11 years. I have a two-part question. First part, we know that the bedrock of philanthropy in this country is tax deductibility. So the question that I'm asking you is there, and I know as a businessman how rigorous the Chinese tax collectors are. They don't miss a bet. Is there any discussion on tax deductibility for Chinese business contributions to either their own or other charities? So that's the first question, the discussion of not tax-exempt organizations, but tax deductibility for contributions. The second question has to do with my wife's work with ASAE, the American Society for Association Executives. Are the Chinese trade associations, which are really government or semi-government, are they getting more independent with the growth of private sector? And what are the tensions? Because these SMEs really need a strong, independent voice. So is there a strengthening of the independence of the trade associations?
Right, right. Good questions. Let me take the first one. So the first one is about tax deductibility. And you're right. I mean, when I think the federal government, they put major changes in the tax codes in the 1930s, you saw the blossoming of all these foundations that we all know about, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. They all came out of the 1930s during that period. And I was telling Ambassador Roy that you have similar, there are regulations that allow corporations and individuals to deduct taxes for contributions. I think for companies, maybe up to 12% of, I can't remember if it's 12% of the profits or total revenue, but something to that degree. I don't know how many companies actually take advantage of this or even know about it. my sense, I mean, what I hear on the street is that a lot of people, certainly people, do not understand or understand these regulations or know about them, let alone companies. But I'd be interested to see how many of these private foundations, I think this is maybe one reason why you have the private foundations that have established, the private entrepreneurs that have established these foundations, in addition to the 2004 regulation on foundations.
Do you know whether the regulations are publicly available?
They
Because
should be.
China has the peculiar
Yeah.
thing of sometimes having regulations that are not publicly available.
Right. No, all the regulations, and we're trying to translate. So one of the things we translate on our website are these, we have these, laws and regulations right there. We have laws and regulations, and so if you click on that, you will go to this page where we've translated them, and we have them in Chinese and English side by side, and you can see that, in fact, one of those is, one is the Circular of State Administration of Foreign Exchange on Issues Concerning the Administration of Donations and Foreign Exchange, which Barbara Pillsbury mentioned earlier. And then another is this China Public Welfare Donation Law. Now, right now, they're trying to revise this. They're trying to create a charity law, which apparently is kind of going back and forth between the National People's Congress Standing Committee and the State Council. It's right now in the process of being revised, and we hope to see it come out in the next year or so. But this charity law will apparently be making some changes in the tax deductibility of donations. So we're looking forward to that. The second thing you asked about was about these trade associations. Now, this is kind of interesting as well. This is interesting as well. There's many of these trade associations. Some are more gongos. Some are becoming more independent, as you mentioned. I mean, there are these kind of industry associations that do want to do some lobbying and want them to represent, these associations to represent their members. And I've read a couple of case studies of associations that really do try to represent their members that are becoming more independent. I actually gave like a training session to a bunch of these associations under the Ministry of Civil Affairs. Interesting group. A lot of them said they no longer were getting funding from from the Chinese government, so they were independent in that way. They probably still, I don't know if they had other kinds of ties, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there, and I would guess that again, some of them, I don't have any numbers, I don't have any specific examples for you, but some of these gongos are now kind of trying to become more independent, trying to represent their membership, trying to detach themselves from the government, and that includes some of the public foundations. And I know, for the public foundation area, I know the China Foundation on Poverty Alleviation is one such foundation that is beginning to work more closely with grassroots nonprofits.
Thank you. In the rear.
Hi, Sonia Michelle from the Wilson Center. Scholars of welfare states in the U.S. and in Europe often talk about a sort of reciprocity between civil society and especially private social services in the state. And somebody like Josta Esping Anderson, a political scientist, has said that in a way the private sector sort of gets the government off the hook. If the private sector provides certain services, that alleviates the government from providing those services. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that relationship. I mean, you mentioned a few examples, but and you talked about government looking to civil society for setting up models and so forth, but and for the initiative and ideas. But I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and sort of how and what that's going to look like going forward. I mean, do you see civil society taking the lead on social services? Is the government funding them so that they can carry them out? I mean, there's usually a limit to how much a private organization can do when the need is great. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I've heard of there are cases of local governments contracting out to, I think, migrant schools. And so, this is an example of governments contracting out to nonprofits. This is apparently, from what I've read, a trend that is also beginning to start up in China, and it's a trend which it suggests that the government is beginning to recognize nonprofits as legitimate actors, and to bring them into the fold, and there's other cases as well. I mean, that I could give examples of. I mean, one interesting case is the HIV/AIDS area. HIV/AIDS is a really interesting area because they serve a number of populations or communities that are, how would I say, illegal. I mean, you were talking about drug users, sex workers. It's very difficult for the government to reach these communities. And they recognize that HIV/AIDS NGOs play a real useful role here in getting to that population. And there's a number of HIV/AIDS NGOs that have sprung up over the last 5-7 years as a result of outside funding from the Global Fund, and they work closely with local authorities, with the local health bureau, the local CDC people. So, that's another interesting example. Gays and lesbians would be another example, gays and lesbian organizations, because again, these are communities or groups that are, they're kind of not, I won't say illegal, but they're kind of viewed, they're not quite legitimate in China. And these are the kinds of groups that nonprofits really are more successful in reaching out to. And I think the Chinese government is just beginning to realize that.
Yes.
Church and Bethesda Mellon. This is somewhat derived from the last lady question I was asked. In general, Chinese government really did not do much. I mean, before the 1949, all done by the grassroots structures, such like we call the 民间组织 or 社会团体. And is this disappear after the 1949? And seems the Chinese society somewhat revived. Are they appear now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, from 1949 to about 1980s, right? They disappeared. I mean, those kinds of 民间组织. And then maybe 1980s, you began to see some organizations that were more independent, but they didn't call themselves. I don't know if they had a name for those kinds of organizations at that time, but there was no regulations for them. So
I think now it's westernized, and really, China don't have this kind of NGO. This just 民间组织. I think this is very important because usually Chinese society, national affairs are done by those groups, not done by government.
Yeah, and you're right. There's I think there's a historical background for these kinds of associations, for civil society. Some people say China never had civil society, but I don't think that's true. Yeah, I don't think that's true. Yeah.
In the rear there.
Hi, I'm Zhu Rong. Recently graduated from the Global Environmental Policy program at American University. My question is about what do you say is the biggest challenge of the development of China's civil society? Because I read about many grassroots NGOs, even though their numbers grew very rapidly in recent years, but actually they're very limited in funding and their own capacity, some even paralyzed after they're established. How do you say the establishment of foundations can help their development, and how you see the future trends of their development? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. The nonprofit sector in China has many problems that you just mentioned. Funding, they lack funding, capacity building. They are not very strong, as they don't have strong skills in developing their organization, in engaging in strategic management, in fundraising, all these kinds of problems. All these kinds of skills they lack. They lack legitimacy. Chinese people often don't know what NGOs are or nonprofits are. The government suspects them of being instigators, of revolution or anti-government. So, there's a lot of these kinds of problems. I think what can foundations help with? Well, foundations can first of all help with funding, right? They can support these nonprofits with money, especially, and this is a debate that's going on right now. Do you give money just for projects, or do you give money for core funding, that is administration and staff? You know, you see a lot of these nonprofits, they're really small, and they go around and they chase after one project after another. So they do one project and then they're done with that, and they go and chase after another, get money for another project, but they have no money to actually pay themselves. They're just like, they exist to just implement these projects, because a lot of foundations and also international founders, a lot of embassies are only willing to give money for projects. All right, they're not willing to give money to build the administration, the staff, to professionalize these staff, to try to train them. They don't give any money for that. So this is a big problem. The question is whether foundations are going to be willing to commit the money to building to this kind of core funding, what we call core or administration support. Narada, one of those foundations that I put up here, is Narada has given money to a lot of these nonprofits for core funding. The second thing that I think that nonprofit foundations can bring to nonprofits is professionalism. You know, because a lot of these nonprofits are not well funded, they can't attract good staff. Foundations can. People like Narada, foundations like Narada, Vantone, UChange, some of these big foundations that are interested in being at the forefront of this movement, their staff, their executive directors are high. They've got master's degrees from the Kennedy School. You know, they know the nonprofit field. They were trained in this. They know this area, and they're real professional about it. But they only got these people because they were willing to pay them what they were worth. So I'm hoping that, you know, and I think foundations are also hoping that if they can give money to core funding for nonprofits, that you know, they all be able to attract that kind of professionalism as well. And the foundations, by bringing professionals into this whole nonprofit sector, that hopefully that will kind of trickle down to these nonprofits. So, you know, we'll see, but I think they're hoping that foundations will have that effect on the nonprofit world by bringing all these people who, like, you know, we're in the business world, they're in the business sector. They have, you know, professional experience in fundraising and in strategic planning, that they'll get these people interested in the nonprofit sector, and that will kind of create a synergy. So, yeah.
Yes, over here.
Good afternoon. My name's Becky Fraser. I'm with the Chamber. I have a two-part question for you. Could you talk a little bit about Western foundations in China, some of the barriers that they face? The second part is with Buffett and Gates in China recently, looking at talking more about encouraging some of the wealthier Chinese to look at some giving options. Could you explore how you envision that initiative unfolding? Do you anticipate seeing more foundations starting that are funded by some of the wealthy in China?
Yeah, so the first one was about the Western foundations. Okay, and I'll try and do this without naming names, but you know, Western foundations have always been under a difficult situation in China. There's no regulation that actually specifically governs international foundations. Probably the closest is the 2004 regulation on foundation management, which does mention international foundations. But as a result, very few international NGOs and foundations in China are actually registered. Only a very few are. And because to register, you have to have a government sponsor. You have to have a government agency that's willing to sponsor you. A lot of government agencies are willing to have, incur the hassle or the risk of sponsoring a international foundation. So this has been a problem, and foundations and international organizations have engaged in a number of creative fixes to this problem to be able to operate in China. So so that just gives you some sense of, you know, the difficulties. And now they're also facing some issues now with this new foreign exchange law about funding Chinese nonprofits and getting those funds released to the nonprofits. That's an additional kind of hurdle that they have to jump. Recently in Yunnan, there was a Yunnan government where there's a lot of international NGOs put out a regulation for international NGOs to better regulate international NGOs, requiring international NGOs to put their record on file. It's not really a registration, it's called Bei'an, which is to put your record on file, but it means that you are then, you have your file with the Yunnan provincial government, the civil affairs people. So there's that experiment to try to better regulate these international NGOs. It's the first regulation I've seen that actually mentions international NGOs specifically. And it looks like that's kind of a process, kind of a learning process for the Yunnan provincial government, for the civil affairs people. They're trying to figure out how best to service these international NGOs and make their work a little bit smoother. Some people think that's just another way to sort of control international NGOs, and yeah, I'm certainly sure that may be one reason. But I think, just like any government, they have to figure out how best to regulate this sector. So that's the first part. The second part of your question was, I'm sorry, what was that about the?
The impact of Buffett and Gates.
So as people know, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett went to China to speak to the wealthiest people in China, the wealthiest tycoons in China, to talk to them about giving their money to charity, and not just keeping it all for themselves. And some of our translations actually from the special issue record some debates or discussions, some reactions about the Gates and Buffett visit. I think there's one about it occurred during the second private foundation forum, and I think it was a good event overall because it really sparked discussion and debate about what philanthropy is and what charity is in China. When Gates and Buffett, they met in this palatial French style, estate out in the suburb of Beijing, and they had all these really wealthy people there. And in response, I think a bunch of just ordinary Chinese people, they decided to have their own Gates and Buffett dinner for ordinary people to engage in charity. And they had a table reserved for Gates and Buffett. And of course, they never showed up. But they were trying to make the point that charity is not for the wealthy alone. It's also for ordinary people. Some of the private entrepreneurs also were discussing this idea of naked donations, because Buffett and Gates, they want to leave all their money to charity and nothing to their families, so they call that naked. It's like he leaves you naked or something like that. And so a number of private entrepreneurs were saying, well, maybe they didn't quite agree with that, and others thought, that maybe it was a good idea. There's But and some people have used Gates and Buffett as a positive example of how good grant making can occur. There's one, one example of charity, a Chinese approach to charity is this guy Cheng Guangbiao, who's one of the wealthiest men in China, and he has given a lot of money to charity. But his brand of charity is basically to go out with a bunch of 100 yuan bills and then hand them out to these poor farmers. And he claims, he gets the most out of this approach because it's so direct. You can see the people, eye to eye. But some people have criticized him for that. They say, if you've got so much money you want to give out, it doesn't take a lot of time. It's kind of inefficient to go out and hand out all this money to people, especially the more money you have, it's just going to take more time. So maybe think about engaging in intelligent grant making and hiring some people to make good grants to maybe nonprofits rather than going and giving money to. You don't know how they use that money either. How do these people who are holding these 100 kwai bills, how are they going to use it? Maybe they'll just go and buy some baijiu at the local store. So so there's been all these kinds of debates that have been stimulated by things like the Gates and Buffett visit. But I think it's all good. The Red Cross scandal. People are starting to talk about what philanthropy means, what charity means, what voluntary activities mean in China. I think that's all for the good to make these kinds of issues, bring them into the public eye, and get people to talk about it.
We're running out of time. I'd like to thank you, Professor Xie, for a very interesting presentation, and thank all of you for a set of very good questions. My impression, just to briefly summarize, is that the whole nature of the debate in China on these questions now is very different from what it was 10 to 15 years ago. And it's a illustration of how the changes in China are changing the context within which people are debating these issues. But the underlying problem which the Chinese government is wrestling with, not entirely successfully, is that for a government that wants to maintain total control over any organized activity, the whole concept of NGO activities presents some contradictions that the government doesn't know how to manage. And that process is probably going to play itself out over a number of years, and it's uncertain what the future will be, but certainly the trend of the last 10 years has been toward an expansion of this sector rather than a contraction, and a shift in attitudes in China as it becomes more prosperous toward wanting more organized ways to engage in charitable and humanitarian activities.
Right. Yeah, and I think you summed that up really, really well. And I would just add that, you know, I think maybe as long as the political system in China probably stays unchanged, that we will continue to see those kinds of tensions that you talked about between the government and the nonprofit sector. So
Thank you very much.
This is